The racist cop handcuffed a homeless black woman just to show off his authority, but what he didn't know was that she was actually an undercover FBI agent, and what happened to him shocked everyone. It happened in broad daylight. Crowds passing by. Car horns. A boy crying. And the sound of metal cuffs clinking behind a woman's back. That was the moment everything shifted. That was the moment a man in uniform, drunk on power and prejudice, exposed not just who he was, but how deeply broken the system around him truly had become. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She didn't even flinch. She just stared. And that stare, that quiet, penetrating, steady stare, it held more rage, more pain, more control than any weapon ever could. It all started outside a small corner store, tucked between two buildings in a rundown block of downtown. A young black teenager had just been shoved out of the store by a white manager accusing him of stealing. The boy was shaking. His voice barely audible. "I didn't take nothing, man. I swear. I didn't even touch it." But the store owner was already yelling, threatening to call the police, his finger jabbing the air like a weapon. That's when she stepped in. Ragged coat. Matted hair. Shoes nearly falling apart. A shopping cart beside her filled with what most people would call trash. Just another homeless woman, it seemed. But she had seen everything. And something inside her couldn't stay silent. She moved between the boy and the store owner, her voice firm but calm. "He didn't do anything. I saw it. You need to back off. Wrong place. Wrong time. Or maybe, the right place, at the perfect time." That was when the sirens came. The flashing lights. The white officer stepping out of the cruiser like a man walking into war. He didn't ask questions. He didn't want facts. All he saw was a black woman, dirty, poor-looking, standing up to a white store manager and getting in the way of what he thought was justice. Or worse, disrespect. Because that's what it was really about. Not the law. Not public safety. But ego. Pride wrapped in a badge. Authority dipped in hate. "Back away, ma'am. This doesn't concern you," he barked. "She's just trying to help," the boy cried, his voice cracking. "I said step back," the officer roared. And then it happened. In one swift move, he grabbed her wrist and twisted it behind her back. She stumbled, but didn't fall. Her body tense, but still. Silent. Calm. He forced her to her knees. Jammed the cuffs on. The crowd had started to gather. Phones out. Recording. Whispering. Some yelled out to stop. Others watched, frozen. The officer didn't care. If anything, the cameras only made him puff his chest bigger. "Let this be a lesson," he muttered, his voice low, just for her to hear. "This is what happens when trash gets in the way." She didn't say a word. And that's when the humiliation became more than just physical. It wasn't about the cuffs. It wasn't about the concrete pressing into her knees. It was the look in his eyes. That disgusting mix of arrogance and disdain. Like he'd won. Like he thought he was doing something noble, teaching a lesson to someone he believed was beneath him. Like she was the problem. Just another nobody. A nuisance. Something to be cleaned up off the street. But what he didn't know, what nobody there knew, was that every inch of her body, from her frayed coat to her filthy fingernails, was part of a cover. A disguise. A calculated mask built for an undercover operation that had taken months to design. And today wasn't just another day on the street. Today was the day. The day she was supposed to intercept a suspect connected to a growing corruption scandal involving law enforcement. The very scandal that this officer, unknowingly, had just walked himself into. Because the woman he thought he was humiliating wasn't a nobody. She was a federal agent. And not just any agent. One of the best. chosen for her ability to disappear in plain sight. To move among the shadows of the system she had sworn to expose. And this time, the shadow wore a uniform. What began as a cruel display of authority quickly became something else, something far bigger. That moment. That humiliation. That click of the handcuffs. It was all recorded. All seen. And soon, it would be broadcast. Reviewed. Investigated. Torn apart frame by frame. And when the truth came out, when she stood, days later, in front of the cameras, not in rags but in her full FBI suit, everything changed. But before that twist could come, she had to endure. Had to bite her tongue as her rights were trampled. Had to stay quiet as he dragged her to his cruiser. Had to watch as he smirked in the rearview mirror like a man who just cleaned the streets of one more problem. He had no idea that the woman he'd cuffed wasn't a threat to society. She was society's reckoning. And as the cruiser pulled away, the boy left behind in tears, the crowd silenced in confusion, there was one thought that echoed in her mind: how many others like him walk the streets unchecked? How many badges hide hate? What he did wasn't just a mistake. It was a confession. And she had just caught it all on tape. Now, with her identity still hidden, her mission compromised, and her fury contained behind clenched teeth, the question is, will she be able to expose everything without blowing the entire operation? Or will the same system that tried to bury her once, try again? Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you speechless. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. To every black viewer watching this, your life, your voice, and your experience matter. This channel exists to tell stories that challenge injustice and celebrate resilience. If you've ever been judged by your skin and not your soul, this one's for you. Enjoy the story, stay strong, and don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist for more powerful narratives. The sun had just started to rise over the rusted rooftops and graffiti-stained bricks of East Baltimore, casting an orange haze over the cracked sidewalks and tired storefronts that lined the blocks like silent witnesses to 1,000 untold stories. The city was loud even in its silence, the hum of early buses, the buzz of flickering neon signs that hadn't turned off from the night before, and the occasional shout from inside a narrow alley. This was a part of the city that didn't get postcards. The kind of neighborhood reporters only mentioned with statistics and warnings. And right in the middle of all that noise and numbness, sat a woman who had learned long ago that being invisible could be her greatest weapon. Her name was Amara Tate. 38 years old. Born in Birmingham, Alabama, and raised by her grandmother after her parents were killed in a house fire set by white supremacists when she was just 7. A trauma like that doesn't heal, it roots. And in Amara, it grew into a fire, one that no amount of loss or fear could put out. She wasn't the kind of agent that made headlines. She didn't seek medals, didn't care for praise. What she cared about was truth. And justice. The kind of justice that didn't come in press conferences or courtroom applause, the kind that crawled through the dirt, looked evil in the eye, and said, "I see you." But here, in this part of Baltimore, no one saw her. And that was the point. For 3 weeks, Amara had been living undercover as a homeless woman named Debbie. She slept under overpasses, ate from shelters, and watched. Always watching. Every alley, every street corner, every squad car that cruised past too slowly or too fast. She was gathering intel for an internal federal investigation targeting systemic abuse inside certain police departments, corruption, cover-ups, targeted brutality. She had already seen enough to make her stomach churn, but protocol meant patience. Her job wasn't to react. It was to observe. Record. Report. Not feel. But that was the hardest part, pretending not to care. Pretending to be someone nobody cared about. She'd gotten good at it. She carried an old, squeaky shopping cart with random bags and broken umbrellas, a pair of gloves with holes at the fingertips, and a large coat that smelled of smoke and rain. Her hair was tucked under a beanie crusted with city grime, and her face was always downcast, as if life itself had beaten the resistance out of her. But inside, beneath every ragged breath, was the fire of a woman who remembered every name the world had forgotten. She knew how quickly people dismissed what they didn't understand. How often society confused poverty with worthlessness. And in that confusion, people revealed who they really were. Not far from where she'd set up that morning, a teenager named Isaiah stumbled out of a corner store, his voice trembling with confusion. He was tall for his age, barely 16, with deep brown skin and sharp eyes that hadn't yet learned how to hide fear. A white store manager was following close behind, yelling accusations about theft and waving a receipt like a weapon. Isaiah kept insisting he hadn't stolen anything, that he'd just looked at a phone charger and left when he saw the price. But the man wasn't listening. He was yelling, loud and theatrical, using words like thief and punk and troublemaker. People across the street turned to look, but no one intervened. No one ever did. Amara watched from her spot near a bus stop bench, eyes narrowed behind her filthy scarf. She knew that look in the store manager's eyes, the one that said I don't need proof, just prejudice. She stood slowly, pushing her cart aside, and made her way toward the boy. Her steps were slow, deliberate, calculated. She wasn't supposed to blow her cover, wasn't supposed to engage. But something about the boy, maybe his trembling hands, or the way his lips quivered like he was holding back tears, made it impossible to stay still. She stepped between them. That boy didn't steal anything, she said, her voice low but firm. I was sitting here the whole time. He walked in, looked around, and walked out. You need to calm down. The store manager turned to her, scoffing, then laughing. Of course you're defending him, he said, looking her up and down. Birds of a feather. I should have known. Amara clenched her jaw, heart pounding with rage she couldn't afford to show. She knew what came next. The police would be called. They always were when someone who looked like her spoke up. She considered stepping back, retreating, disappearing again into the role of Debbie. But then the manager pulled out his phone and shouted, I'm calling the cops. Let's see what they have to say about this little gang reunion. The call went out. And within minutes, a patrol car pulled up. White. Clean. Shiny. The kind that made people straighten up and children run home. The officer stepped out like he owned the sidewalk. Broad chest, square jaw, cold eyes. His name was Officer Ryan Mallory. He had 7 years on the force and 17 complaints for excessive force, none of which had ever stuck. He walked like a man who'd never been challenged and spoke like someone who thought the law bent to his will. What's the problem here? He barked. The store manager ran up, pointing fingers. This kid tried to steal from me, and then this vagrant got in my face trying to start trouble. Officer Mallory looked Isaiah up and down, then turned to Amara. He didn't ask questions. Didn't want answers. His mind was already made up. You again, he sneered, walking toward Amara. Didn't I tell you last week to stay out of other people's business? Amara stared at him. I didn't do anything wrong. I saw the whole thing. The kid's innocent. That right? He said, stepping closer. And who the hell are you, huh? Public defender for the homeless? Or just another mouth that doesn't know when to shut up? Isaiah tried to speak. She was just, shut it. Mallory snapped, pointing a finger in the boy's face. And then, without warning, he reached out and grabbed Amara's arm. She didn't resist. Couldn't. Not without risking the entire operation. He twisted her wrist and forced it behind her back. She gasped, not from pain, she'd trained for worse, but from the sheer audacity, the arrogance in his touch. The cuffs clinked around her wrists, cold and unforgiving. He pushed her to her knees. The crowd had started forming. People watching. Filming. Whispering. This is what happens, he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear, when you forget your place. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Every fiber of her being screamed to act, to move, to be who she really was. But she stayed in character. Debbie. Nobody. A homeless woman being cuffed in front of a grocery store for defending a child the system had already labeled as suspicious. The boy was crying now. Please stop. She didn't do nothing. Officer Mallory ignored him. He was already walking her toward the cruiser, proud and puffed up like he'd just won something. And in that moment, he truly believed he had. He thought he'd put a loud black woman back in her place. Thought he'd made an example of her. But what he didn't realize, not yet, was that the woman he had just humiliated in front of an entire block was about to shatter everything he thought he knew about power, control, and justice. Because Amara Tate wasn't just a woman in cuffs. She was a storm, waiting to strike. And he had just given her the perfect reason to. The ride in the back of the police cruiser was silent, except for the creaking of the seat and the distant sound of sirens crossing in another part of the city. Amara sat upright, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back, the metal biting into her skin. The windows were smudged, and the interior smelled of leather and stale coffee. Her eyes scanned every inch of the route, noting the street signs, the angles of turns, and the occasional glances Officer Mallory threw at her in the mirror. He didn't say a word at first, not until they were about 10 blocks away from the scene. You know, he said with a crooked smirk, you people always think you can mouth off and get away with it. But not today. Amara didn't answer. Her silence wasn't submission, it was calculation. Every second she stayed quiet was a second he revealed more of himself. His tone was cocky, arrogant, and deeply satisfied, like a man who thought he'd just cleaned the streets of one more problem. You think standing up for some little punk makes you a hero, he sneered, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. You're just another addict out here pretending to matter. The words stung, not because they were true, but because he believed them so easily. The sheer confidence with which he assumed her worth, or lack thereof, made her stomach tighten. But she kept her expression flat. She couldn't afford to let anything slip, not yet. The operation wasn't over, even if her role had just taken a violent turn. At the station, she was processed like any other arrestee. Her prints taken. Her belongings, a crushed cigarette box, some loose change, a stained handkerchief, catalogued with casual indifference. The officers barely looked at her face. No one asked questions. No one wondered why a supposedly homeless woman had no prior record, no outstanding warrants, no ID, no name that turned up anything in the system. The uniform made them lazy. The assumption of guilt filled in every gap. She was dressed like someone who didn't matter, so she didn't. She was placed in a holding cell with 2 other women. One was older, clearly intoxicated, mumbling to herself in a corner. The other was younger, maybe mid-20s, pacing like a caged animal. Amara sat on the bench and waited, listening, watching, filing every detail away. An officer walked by, paused at the bars, and shook his head. You were doing good, Debbie, he chuckled. Heard you were even handing out sandwiches last week. Should have stayed quiet. She didn't even blink. He knew her by the name she'd used in cover. Good. That meant her identity was still intact. For now. Hours passed. The air in the cell was thick with sweat and despair. The younger woman finally sat next to Amara and whispered, he always gets away with it. That cop. Mallory. My cousin filed a complaint last year after he slammed her on the hood of his car. Nothing happened. They said there wasn't enough evidence. Amara's eyes turned toward her, steady and calm. What happened to your cousin? She moved, the girl replied. Said she couldn't walk down the street without flinching anymore. Amara nodded slowly, as if absorbing the weight of that truth. Every story she heard, every bruise hidden beneath sleeves, every whispered accusation dismissed without follow-up, it all stacked, brick by brick, into the quiet fury rising in her chest. She wasn't here by accident. Mallory wasn't just a random officer with a bad attitude. He was a name on a list. A red flag in a sea of unchecked violence. And now, by his own hand, he'd put himself at the center of her investigation. After her release, no charges filed, insufficient cause, was the excuse. She walked back to the same block she'd been taken from, this time under the heavy cover of night. Her cart had been abandoned near the corner. The boy, Isaiah, was nowhere to be seen. She hoped he made it home. The cameras across the street had caught everything. She knew the locations by heart, one over the liquor store, one embedded near the crosswalk. The tech team would retrieve the footage. All she had to do now was stay the course. The next morning, she returned to her usual routine. Sit outside the community center. Pretend to pick at her gloves. Nod politely when people passed. From across the street, she saw Mallory's cruiser roll by. He didn't stop. But he looked. And there was something in that look, a twitch in his jaw, a pause just a little too long, that told her he was trying to remember. Trying to figure out why something didn't add up. At the local shelter, whispers had already started. That cop went too far, someone said. She didn't do nothing. Even in the places the city forgot, people remembered. Amara moved through them like smoke, listening, gathering pieces. And every day, the web grew tighter. One afternoon, she saw Isaiah again. He was sitting on the steps outside the library, head down, earbuds in. She sat beside him, quietly. He glanced at her, recognition blooming in his eyes. "They let you go," he said softly. "Yeah," she replied. "You okay?" He nodded, but his voice shook. "My mom said I was lucky. Said I should stop going to that store." Amara looked at him, her voice steady. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," he said. "But they don't care." That sentence sat between them like a boulder. Heavy, undeniable. Later that week, the investigation team met her at a nearby safe house, a small, plain apartment where the wallpaper peeled and the pipes creaked. She changed out of her disguise, scrubbed the grime from her skin, and stood in front of a mirror that reflected a different woman. The agent. The professional. The one who had been watching all along. "Mallory's on file," one of the agents told her. "He's been protected for years. Internal reviews, sealed complaints, witness intimidation. But now we have footage. And we have you." Amara stared at the screen as they played back the arrest. The angle from the liquor store camera caught everything, the aggressive body language, the disregard for protocol, the humiliation. Every second was a nail in his coffin. But she wasn't smiling. Because she knew that exposure wasn't enough. These men had weathered scandals before. The only way to take them down was to make the system turn on itself. Back on the street, Mallory was getting nervous. He'd been asked to file a report on the arrest, and the inconsistencies were starting to show. The captain pulled him aside, asked why he cuffed a woman without probable cause. Mallory blamed her attitude, said she was obstructing justice. But there were too many eyes now. Too many whispers. One night, Amara overheard a conversation outside the station, two officers talking in hushed tones. "You think she's a plant?" one asked. "She's too calm. Something's off." Mallory dismissed it, but it lingered. He started following her, circling her block, watching from across the street. Paranoia crept into his routine. He started snapping at his partner, drinking coffee like it was water, checking the mirrors too often. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know what. The final move was close. The tech team was ready. The internal affairs contact had been briefed. But Amara had one more play. One more piece of the puzzle to secure. She needed Mallory to say it. On tape. Not just what he did, but why. His words. His belief. The root of the hatred. So she waited. Sat outside the same corner store. Wore the same coat. And when he came, angry, pacing, eyes full of something he couldn't name, she stood. You didn't learn, huh? He hissed, stepping closer. Still out here playing savior? She looked at him calmly. Still out here playing God? He stepped in, nose to nose. You think you're special? Just 'cause you talked back. You're nothing. Always been nothing. But she didn't flinch. And what she said next would be the match that lit the explosion. The street was unusually quiet that afternoon. The kind of quiet that feels planned. Orchestrated. Like the world had taken a collective breath before something heavy was about to land. The clouds had rolled in without warning, covering the sun with thick, colorless layers. The air felt tight, pressed down by a silence that didn't belong. Amara sat on her usual spot by the corner store, her fingers loosely gripping the handle of her cart, her body slouched just enough to blend into the surroundings, yet alert beneath every layer of disguise. Across the street, Officer Mallory stood by his cruiser, pretending to check his phone, though his eyes never left her. He hadn't spoken since their last confrontation, the one where she planted the seed, the subtle suggestion that she knew something he didn't, that she wasn't who he thought. Since then, he'd become erratic. Less composed. He wasn't used to fear. And now, he was drowning in it. She saw him cross the street. His steps were firm but uneven, a man forcing confidence over a growing spiral of doubt. She didn't move, not even as his shadow fell over her. He stood too close, arms stiff at his sides. His voice came low, gritty with something that sounded like panic wrapped in anger. You're not just some homeless woman, are you? Amara slowly looked up. Her eyes met his, calm and sharp. Is that what you think? He scoffed, but there was no conviction in it. I've been watching. You don't sleep like the others. You don't beg. You ask questions. You talk too much. People talk to you like they trust you. Like you're somebody. She tilted her head. Maybe they see something you don't. He leaned in closer, whispering, Who the hell are you? She didn't answer. And that was when he cracked. You set me up, he hissed, teeth clenched, eyes twitching with paranoia. You think you're gonna make me look like one of those monsters they put on TV? Is that what this is? Some kind of setup for your little social justice story? Amara finally stood, slow and deliberate. She towered over him in silence, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze unwavering. You made yourself look like that, she said, her voice steady. All I did was stand still. His breathing quickened. You recorded me. She didn't blink. You think they're gonna care, he growled. You think some edited video's gonna do anything? I got friends in this department. You don't know how deep this goes. I do, she replied, her tone razor sharp, and that's why I'm here. Mallory took a step back like her words had weight. He looked around, suddenly aware of how visible he was. Across the street, a man walked his dog. A woman pulled her child closer as she passed. Phones were out. Recording. He felt the walls closing in. And then his voice shifted, less anger now, more desperation. You don't understand what you're doing, he muttered. You think you're helping people, but this city eats people like you alive. You start pulling on these strings and everything falls apart. The whole damn system collapses. Amara stepped closer. Then maybe it needs to. That was the moment. His face dropped. Like he finally saw it. Not just who she was, but what she represented. Not just a woman he'd cuffed on a sidewalk, but a mirror held up to everything he pretended not to be. And he hated her for it. She turned her back to him and began pushing her cart. For a second, it seemed like he'd let her go. But then came the click of his steps behind her, fast, aggressive. He grabbed her shoulder. You're gonna stop, he growled. Right now. She turned, slowly. The click of another sound followed, not a threat, not a weapon, but the subtle buzz of a body mic activating inside her collar. He didn't notice. His breath was ragged. Her voice, in contrast, was smooth and direct. "You know what the difference is between us?" she asked, eyes locked onto his. "You hide behind a badge because you're afraid of what you really are. I take mine off to show who I've always been." His eyes widened. "What the hell are you talking about?" That's when it happened. A black SUV pulled up behind them without sirens, just a quiet roll against the curb. 2 agents stepped out. Suits. Earpieces. Calm. Efficient. They didn't run. They didn't yell. They walked toward Mallory like the end of a long equation finally being solved. He spun, confused. "What is this?" "Federal Bureau of Investigation," one of them said, flashing his badge. "We need to speak with you regarding an ongoing internal investigation. You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. Please hand over your weapon and badge." Mallory froze. Amara stepped back and removed her beanie. Her hair fell into place. She reached into her coat and pulled a sleek black wallet, opening it to reveal her own credentials. The golden letters glinted even in the overcast light. "Special Agent Amara Tate," she said clearly, letting the words slice the air between them. "Undercover Division. I've been working with Internal Affairs on an active investigation of systemic abuse and misconduct within this district. You just confirmed everything we needed." The silence that followed was deafening. Mallory's mouth opened, then closed, like he was trying to find a lie big enough to swallow the moment whole. But nothing came. His hands trembled as he reached for his badge. One of the agents took it gently, like removing a mask he didn't deserve to wear anymore. "You can't do this," he muttered, stepping backward. "You did this," Amara said. "I just documented it." One of the officers began reading him his rights. His protests grew louder, more incoherent. He shouted about betrayal, about being set up, about politics and lies. But the volume didn't matter anymore. The eyes were on him now, and the truth didn't need to yell. The bystanders watched as he was guided into the SUV. Some cheered softly. Others just stared in disbelief. Amara stood still, breathing in the weight of the moment. Not satisfaction, not yet, but something deeper. A shift. A crack in a wall that had once seemed unbreakable. But even as Mallory disappeared down the street, escorted by the same authority he once thought he controlled, Amara knew this was only the beginning. His fall would cause waves. And in those waves, more names would surface. More faces. More truths. And somewhere deep in the silence that followed, one question echoed louder than the rest: what happens when the badge becomes the mask, and justice finally takes it off? The SUV disappeared into the distance, the weight of everything that had just happened lingering like static in the air. Amara didn't move. Her hands rested lightly on the rim of her cart, but her mind was elsewhere, locked in that quiet, electric hum that comes after a storm. Around her, the world kept spinning, traffic lights blinked red and green, someone across the street lit a cigarette, a child cried 2 blocks away, but inside her chest, something had shifted. Not relief. Not yet. More like release. A slow, painful exhale after years of holding breath. And yet, even as the tension drained from her shoulders, she knew this moment, powerful as it was only a fracture in a much larger wall. And that wall would fight back. Back at the precinct, chaos brewed beneath polished floors and cold fluorescent lights. The arrest of Officer Mallory had sent shockwaves through the department. Some officers whispered in corners, glancing nervously at closed office doors. Others seethed openly, making sharp comments about betrayal and rats in the system. A few nodded in grim silence, as if they'd known all along but had learned long ago to keep their heads down. Amara entered through the side entrance, escorted by 2 fellow agents. Her coat was gone now, her identity no longer a disguise but a declaration. She walked through those halls like a storm made flesh, her eyes scanning every face that dared to meet hers. Captain Rhodes met her near the elevator. His expression was tight, unreadable. For years, he'd run the precinct like a ship on autopilot, avoiding scandals, smoothing over conflicts, prioritizing reputation over reform. But now, that carefully crafted balance was unraveling in his hands. "Agent Tate," he said, his voice clipped. "Captain," she returned, her tone even sharper. "You've caused quite a stir." "I didn't cause anything," she replied. "I revealed it." He paused, eyes narrowing. "We could have handled this internally." She stepped closer, her voice low and calm, yet heavy with truth. "You had years to handle it. You didn't. So we did." He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured toward the conference room. Inside, monitors were already set up, playing clips from her investigation, surveillance footage, body cam feeds, interview transcripts. Every word Mallory had spoken in those final moments was recorded. Every threat. Every denial. Every admission. Amara stood at the head of the table, surrounded by a team of agents and 2 internal affairs investigators. The room buzzed with tension as they reviewed the timeline of abuse, the protection Mallory had received, the chain of complicity that stretched beyond a single man. As the footage played, Amara's eyes drifted to one of the officers in the back. It was Deputy Collins, young, sharp, always polite. He'd brought her water once in holding, avoided eye contact when Mallory dragged her through the hallway. Now he stood frozen, jaw tight, a storm brewing behind his eyes. After the presentation, the room cleared slowly. Only Collins stayed behind. He finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I knew something was wrong with him. I didn't know what to do." Amara turned to face him fully. "You do now." He nodded, shame mixing with resolve. "I want to help." "Then speak. Tell them what you've seen. What you know." His eyes flickered. "They'll come for me." "They already are," she said. "The question is, will you still be standing when they do?" Across the city, the news broke like a thunderclap. Local stations interrupted regular programming. "Baltimore officer arrested in FBI sting operation," the headlines read. Clips from the sidewalk confrontation flooded social media, already spreading beyond state lines. Comment sections exploded. Some praised Amara, others screamed conspiracy, and some couldn't believe a woman dressed like a homeless person could be anything but. But the truth was out now. And it was louder than the denial. Meanwhile, in a locked room inside the federal building, Mallory sat across from 2 agents. His cuffs had been removed, but the weight of consequence had replaced them. His face was pale, his jaw clenched in quiet fury. He refused to speak, refused to look at the screen showing his own face twisted in rage and contempt. "You're going to prison," one of the agents said calmly. "You can cooperate and reduce the damage, or keep playing tough and watch everything else collapse with you." Mallory laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "You really think any of this matters? There's 10 more like me waiting to take my place. And we'll take them too," the agent replied. Later that evening, Amara sat alone in the safe house, staring at the file spread out in front of her. Photos. Names. Reports. Mallory was just the first. There were others. And some of them wore higher ranks. The operation wasn't over, it had just reached a new level. She leaned back in the chair, exhaustion finally hitting her bones. She had won a battle. But the war was rooted in generations. A knock at the door pulled her from thought. It was Isaiah. He looked nervous, eyes wide, fingers fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. "They said I could come," he said quickly. "That you'd want to see me." She nodded, gesturing him inside. He sat, awkward and quiet. "I saw it on TV," he said. "They showed the whole thing." "You're FBI?" "Yes," she said, watching his reaction. He looked down. "I thought you were like me." "I am," she said. "That's why I did it." His throat tightened. "I felt so stupid. I thought I didn't matter." "You do," she said firmly. "And they made you believe otherwise. That's the lie. That's the real crime." Tears brimmed in his eyes, but he wiped them away. "You made him pay. No one ever makes them pay." She leaned forward. "I didn't do this for revenge. I did it because you deserve to walk into a store without being hunted. You deserve to grow up without thinking you're the enemy. And you're not alone." He nodded slowly, understanding sinking in. Before he left, he turned to her. "What happens now?" Amara looked out the window at the quiet street below. "Now," she said softly, "we keep going. Until the ones hiding behind their badges remember what they're supposed to stand for." He didn't speak again. Just nodded and walked away. She sat for a long time after that, alone in the fading light. The storm had passed, but the air was still heavy. Tomorrow would bring more headlines. More accusations. More resistance. But for tonight, for this small, silent breath in the middle of a war, she allowed herself to feel something close to peace. The morning after Mallory's arrest, the atmosphere across the department was a volatile mix of disbelief, resentment, and quiet reckoning. Conversations behind closed doors became sharp and short, glances between officers were layered with suspicion and fear, and every shift started under the shadow of uncertainty. Whispers moved through the halls like wildfire, about the sting operation, about who knew what and when, about who might be next. In precincts built on loyalty and silence, exposure was a poison, and Amara's presence had shattered the delicate facade of brotherhood. Now, every officer faced an unspoken question: which side of the line were they really standing on? Back at the federal building, Amara sat in the situation room, reviewing evidence that had once been scattered and fragmentary but now formed a mosaic of brutal clarity. The wall in front of her was pinned with names, photos, dates, red threads connecting cases that had long been dismissed as isolated incidents. Each thread was a story, a wound, a name she refused to let vanish into the paperwork. The operation had reached its next phase, one far more delicate than the first. Mallory's fall had pulled the curtain back, but what lay behind it was more dangerous: a network of complicit silence, officers who covered for one another, supervisors who shredded complaints, officials who made backroom deals in exchange for loyalty. Amara knew that striking down one man wasn't enough. Real change demanded more than justice served; it required truth exposed, systems dismantled, and most of all, the people inside those systems facing themselves. But as she built her next move, she wasn't just watching suspects, she was being watched too. The praise came in waves online, but offline, in the corridors of power and behind stoic faces, there was resistance. People in suits who wanted the fire to die down quietly, who said they supported her but subtly suggested she should consider the political consequences. One agent, seasoned and respected, even pulled her aside to ask if she really wanted to keep pushing. "You've done enough," he said. "Let it be." But Amara didn't come this far to let it be. Her nights were restless. Not from fear, but from the weight of choices. She thought of Isaiah often, of the way his voice cracked when he asked what would happen next. She thought about the dozens of people whose stories mirrored his, silenced, ignored, rewritten by reports that protected reputations rather than rights. And deeper still, she carried the memory of her parents, the fire that stole them, the system that never held anyone accountable. She had sworn, long before the badge and the title, that she would never be a bystander to that kind of erasure. One evening, as she left the office and stepped into the dusky light of the city, she found herself face to face with Captain Rhodes again. He wasn't in uniform. No badges, no rank, just a man standing under the burden of a crumbling empire. His tone was quieter than before, but still guarded. "They're digging into everything now," he said. "Old files, past decisions. People are scared." "Good," she said without hesitation. He shifted uncomfortably. "Not everyone in that building is dirty." "Then they have nothing to fear," she answered. He paused, as if weighing something that had been growing in his conscience for years. "You really think tearing it all down is the way?" Amara looked him in the eye. "I think protecting it has never stopped the bleeding." They stood there for a moment, two people who had taken radically different paths through the same broken terrain. Then he sighed, nodded once, and walked away. A silent acknowledgement that things would never go back to what they were. As the days passed, the headlines evolved. National coverage picked up the story. Civil rights leaders, former officers, politicians, and victims' families began speaking out. Some hailed Amara as a hero. Others called her a traitor. One news anchor framed her as a symbol of the moral dilemma within modern policing. But Amara didn't care about symbols. She wanted results. Inside the department, internal affairs began its descent. Officers were pulled into rooms and asked questions they'd long buried. Surveillance footage was reviewed with fresh eyes. The cold case files that had gathered dust were reopened. Some officers left voluntarily, handing in their badges before the storm reached them. Others fought back, legally, politically, and in whispers behind locked doors. There were veiled threats, subtle acts of sabotage, and on one occasion, Amara's car tires were slashed in the parking lot. It didn't rattle her. It confirmed she was close. But what she didn't expect was how the weight of her actions would begin to test her moral compass. Not in theory, but in practice. Because not every name on the wall was a monster. Some were officers who had made terrible choices under terrible pressure. Others were caught in systems they didn't build but never challenged. One file in particular caught her eye, Officer Cruz. Young, decorated, Latino, a record both clean and courageous. But tied to two cases where complaints had been misplaced. When she requested his file, a supervisor questioned her. "Cruz," he said. "He's one of the good ones." She pressed anyway. She reviewed footage. Interviewed former patrol partners. What she found wasn't guilt, it was silence. Cruz hadn't committed violence. He hadn't turned a blind eye. But he hadn't spoken either. When asked why, his written statement was brutally honest: "I was afraid. I didn't want to end up like the people who did speak out." Amara met him in the interrogation room, but not as an accuser. She sat across from him and laid the files on the table. His hands trembled slightly. "I know what this looks like," he said. "But I never hurt anyone." She nodded. "That's not why you're here. I want to know what stopped you." He stared at her. "You know what stopped me. I want you to say it." He exhaled slowly. "Because the people who did the right thing disappeared. They got transferred. Demoted. Isolated. And I had a kid on the way. I made a choice. I told myself it wasn't my fight. But it was," she said softly. He nodded, ashamed. "It still is." There it was, the complexity. The line between guilt and survival. The human cost of silence. She saw in Cruz not a villain, but a reflection of every good person who let evil persist. And for a moment, she questioned the weight of her crusade. How many lives could be destroyed in pursuit of justice? And would any of it rebuild what had already been broken? The following week, Amara stood before a panel of senior federal officials. The case files were complete. Recommendations were written. But now came the question no one wanted to say aloud: what should be made public? How far should transparency go? One man, older and sharply dressed, leaned forward and asked, "Agent Tate, do you believe every name on that list deserves the same punishment?" She didn't answer immediately. Her silence was long. Measured. "I believe every name on that list deserves accountability," she said. "And if we start compromising that for convenience or comfort, we're no better than the systems we're trying to fix." There was tension in the room. But also something else, respect. As she left the building, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Isaiah. A photo. Him standing in front of a classroom, holding a book. The caption read, "I signed up to speak at school." About what happened? About what you did. Amara stared at the screen, her throat tightening. That was the outcome no file could capture. No press conference could summarize. A boy who once felt invisible now stood in front of others, speaking truth. That was the kind of justice that didn't just punish, it healed. And in that moment, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. But she wasn't walking into it alone. The evening after the federal hearing, Amara walked through the city not as an agent, not as a ghost in disguise, but as a woman caught in the weight of her own mission. The streets hummed with life, unaware of the war waging inside her. Neon lights flickered above corner stores, laughter spilled from restaurants, and buses rolled past like moving shadows. She wandered through it all in silence, her hands deep in her coat pockets, her thoughts louder than anything around her. The success of the operation had brought a tidal wave of consequences, and now those waves were beginning to crash down. Lives were being upended. Reputations shattered. Some families had begun receiving threats. Others had turned on each other. It was justice, yes, but it was messy, painful, and far more personal than she had prepared for. The truth had come to the surface, but no one ever told you how much it cost to keep it there. She sat down at a park bench, the same one where, weeks ago, she had pretended to sleep beneath a tattered blanket. The wind was colder now, sharper. As she sat staring at the empty playground across the street, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Collins, the young deputy who'd first spoken up. He wanted to meet. Said it was important. She didn't hesitate. 15 minutes later, they met in the back of an old diner, the kind that still smelled of burnt coffee and had booths with cracked vinyl seats. He looked exhausted. Pale. Worn down by a conscience that had finally woken up and wouldn't let him sleep. He sat across from her, fidgeting with the lid of his coffee cup. "They're turning on me," he said finally, his voice low. "The ones who are still there. Some of them think I set everything in motion." "You didn't," Amara said calmly. "I did." He shook his head. "You don't understand. I hear them whispering. I know what they're capable of. The other day someone keyed my car. Yesterday, someone left an envelope in my locker. It was empty. But the message was clear." Amara leaned forward. "You did the right thing. You told the truth." He looked at her with a tired smile. "Doesn't feel like it." "It will," she said. "Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But when you look your kids in the eye one day and tell them you stood for something, that moment will come." Collins ran a hand through his hair. "I keep thinking about all the things I let slide. All the times I looked the other way. I keep asking myself if I'm any different from them." Amara studied him for a long moment. "The difference isn't that you were perfect. It's that you stopped pretending the silence was harmless." He nodded slowly, like her words were the first ones that had allowed him to breathe in weeks. But there was more behind his eyes, something heavy. "I need to show you something," he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a flash drive. "There's a folder. From a case last year. I wasn't even part of it directly, but I came across it. The victim filed a complaint. Said Mallory and 2 others tampered with evidence. That file disappeared the next week. But I saved it. I didn't know why. I just did." Amara took the drive without a word, sliding it into her coat. The implications hit her instantly. If what he was saying was true, this wasn't just about use of force or discrimination, it was obstruction. Malicious intent. A deliberate pattern of burying misconduct. It meant that Mallory hadn't just operated in darkness, he'd been protected. Enabled. And it wasn't over. Later that night, back in her office, she plugged in the drive and watched the file unfold. It was worse than she expected. A woman had been assaulted during a traffic stop. The video had been redacted. Witness statements had been altered. And Mallory's name was all over the original draft, then scrubbed clean in the final version. But what caught her attention most was a memo, unsigned, that read, "Too messy. Shut it down." That line echoed in her mind. Not because of what it said, but because of who might have written it. Someone with authority. Someone still untouched. The next morning, she met with her supervisor. They reviewed the contents together, and for the first time since the operation began, she saw something rare in his expression, genuine concern. "This means we're going higher," he said. "We'll need to widen the investigation." She nodded. "I'm ready." But as she walked out of the office, a deeper unease settled in. Because higher meant danger. It meant going after people who knew how to hide. Who knew how to retaliate. And as much as she was committed, she also knew what it could cost. Her career. Her safety. Her sanity. That evening, her phone rang. It was Isaiah again. His voice was bright. Excited. He told her how his classmates had cheered when he spoke. How a teacher had invited him to write an article for the school paper. They listened, he said. They actually listened. And in that moment, Amara felt something crack inside her, not pain, but something like pride mixed with grief. Because for every Isaiah who found his voice, there were still so many others who hadn't. Who never would. And the fight couldn't stop with one name, one arrest, one speech. She returned to the department that week, not undercover, not silent, but with authority. She met with Rhodes one final time, this time in his office. The tension was thick. He sat behind his desk, fingers laced tightly together. "You're pushing too far," he said. "You realize that, right?" "No," she said. "I'm finally pushing where it counts." He leaned forward. "You're about to drag good people through hell." She stared him down. If they've been standing next to the fire all this time, maybe they need to feel the heat. He looked at her with something between frustration and fear. "You think you're the only one who's ever wanted to fix this?" "No," she said. "But I'm the only one doing it without compromise." As she left his office, something in her hardened. Not anger. Not even vengeance. But a refusal to be swayed by doubt. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to be effective. And now, with everything unraveling, she knew what had to come next. A public hearing. A full audit. A naming of names. The city was not ready. But it was time. The sun was setting behind the tall, hollow buildings of downtown Baltimore when Amara entered the city council chamber. The walls inside were lined with faces, journalists, activists, local leaders, and a few officers who had chosen to show up in uniform, perhaps out of defiance, perhaps out of fear. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that settles in the pit of the stomach and keeps people from breathing too deeply. Amara walked past the cameras, past the whispered judgments and forced smiles, and took her seat at the center table, eyes sharp, spine straight, every inch of her reflecting the weight of the truth she was about to lay bare. This wasn't just another meeting. This was a reckoning. Across from her sat the Internal Oversight Panel, a group of appointed officials who had, for years, sat comfortably in the blur between enforcement and excuse. Some looked tired. Others looked quietly ashamed. One or two looked angry, not at her, but at what she represented. The end of complacency. The end of looking the other way. The chairwoman called the hearing to order, her voice trembling just slightly as she invited Amara to speak. Amara began not with accusations, not with files or headlines, but with a story. The story of a boy who had walked into a store and been treated like a threat before he'd even said a word. She spoke slowly, deliberately, painting the picture of Isaiah's fear, the false authority behind the uniform, and the silence that followed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her words carried their own thunder. She told them how that moment was never isolated. How it echoed thousands of others, buried in case files and forgotten names. And then she moved to the evidence, the pattern, the cover-ups, the redacted videos, the erased voices. She spoke of complicity as a choice, not a consequence, and of silence as a form of violence. Every sentence was a blade, every pause a spotlight. The room shifted as she spoke. Some leaned in. Some turned away. A few scribbled notes with shaking hands. When she finished, there was no applause. Just the silence of undeniable truth sinking into the floorboards. Then the questions came. Some were defensive. Some were genuinely curious. One councilman leaned forward, his brow furrowed, asking, "Agent Tate, with all due respect, what exactly do you want us to do?" Amara looked at him, unflinching. "I want you to stop pretending you didn't already know." The air crackled. Another official asked if her methods had gone too far. If perhaps the operation had compromised trust in the department. Amara stared directly at her. Trust that's built on silence isn't trust. It's fear. A beat passed. And then another voice, unexpectedly, joined the conversation. Officer Cruz had entered the room quietly and taken a seat in the back, unnoticed until now. He stood, cleared his throat, and asked to speak. The panel hesitated. Amara didn't. She nodded once, and Cruz stepped forward. He spoke haltingly at first, but his voice grew stronger with each word. He admitted the things he had seen, the things he had failed to report, the fear that had kept him compliant. He spoke of the night he watched a fellow officer use force unnecessarily, of the morning he found a complaint form in the trash. He didn't try to excuse it. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply told the truth. "I don't deserve praise," he said, eyes flicking to Amara. "But I want to be part of whatever comes next. I want to help rebuild this place into something worth protecting." That moment shattered something in the room. A few officers shifted in their seats. Some looked away. But one older sergeant sitting near the aisle crossed his arms, stood, and said, "He's not the only one." What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was quiet, like a dam slowly cracking under pressure. Officers beginning to speak, cautiously, about the things they'd buried. A culture of fear. A system that punished honesty more than brutality. It wasn't all at once. Not everyone spoke. But it was a beginning. A fracture in a wall Amara had spent years preparing to tear down. That night, as she walked out of the chamber into the cold air, the streets buzzed with whispers of what had happened inside. News vans lined the curb. Reporters called out questions, lights flashing like strobe fires. She didn't stop to answer. She walked past them all, her steps slow but certain. Inside her chest, her heart pounded with a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. Back at her apartment, she found a letter slipped under her door. No envelope. Just her name, printed in block letters. She opened it carefully. Inside, a single sentence, "You might have started something you can't finish." She read it twice. Then again. The threat was clear, but it didn't shake her. It confirmed what she already knew, that truth has enemies. And the deeper she went, the louder they would get. But she wasn't alone anymore. Isaiah's voice rang in her mind. Cruz's confession. The officer who stood up. Each one a new piece of the movement forming around her. The next day, she met with the Federal Oversight Committee. They wanted to debrief. Formalize. But Amara made a different request. I want to return to the community, she said. Not undercover. As myself. To speak. To listen. They were hesitant. It's dangerous. The public is volatile. You could be putting yourself at risk. I already have, she replied. But if we're not willing to face them, we can't claim to serve them. So they let her. She went back to the streets she had once walked in disguise. She met with youth groups, church leaders, former inmates, single mothers, and bus drivers. She didn't talk at them. She talked with them. She told them what had happened. What was coming. And more importantly, she asked them what they wanted from justice. Not the polished version in government halls, but the lived version, the kind that meant safety, dignity, respect. One woman, a grandmother with a deep, lined face and eyes that had seen too much, took Amara's hand and said, "We've been waiting for someone to stop talking and start listening." That sentence stayed with her. She knew this was the true work now. Not just arrests. Not just files. But healing. Rebuilding trust where only trauma had lived. And that work would be slower. Harder. Less visible. But it mattered just as much. Meanwhile, the investigation expanded. Indictments were filed. Promotions were frozen. Internal policies were rewritten with direct input from the communities they were supposed to serve. Amara was invited to consult on training programs, not just as an agent, but as someone who had lived the streets, who had seen the cracks from both sides. There were protests, yes. But there were also circles of dialogue. Restorative justice meetings. And for the first time in a long time, people who had once been too afraid to speak began to find their voices again. But it wasn't perfect. There were setbacks. Media smear campaigns. Politicians who tried to spin the narrative. Officers who quietly quit rather than face reform. Threats continued, some veiled, some direct. And some nights, Amara lay awake wondering how long she could keep carrying this fire without burning out. But every time she thought of slowing down, she remembered the look on Isaiah's face when he stood in front of that classroom. The spark in Cruz's eyes when he decided to tell the truth. The silence in that council chamber right before the dam began to break. This wasn't just about Mallory anymore. It never really was. He was a symptom. The disease was deeper. But now, finally, it was being named. And in the naming, there was power. Amara stood in the mirror one morning, tying the badge around her neck again. This time, not as a symbol of status, but as a weapon forged in fire. A reminder of what had been lost, and what could still be saved. Months passed. The city had changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. You could feel it in the way people walked, not faster, not with more certainty, but with just a little more attention, a little more awareness of who was watching, who was listening, and what silence could cost. The badge that had once been a shield for some and a threat to others was now under scrutiny. It wasn't just cloth and metal anymore, it was a question. And it was being asked everywhere. Officer Ryan Mallory was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. The evidence mounted against him was overwhelming, not only from Amara's operation but from old, buried cases that now saw the light. No appeals. No fanfare. No final defense that could wash away the truth. His face disappeared from the nightly news as quickly as it had arrived. There was no ceremony, no pity. And in the place where he had once walked with arrogance, there was only vacancy. A space no longer protected by silence. He left behind a badge, a legacy of fear, and a department forced to confront its rot. Captain Rhodes retired early, citing health and family reasons, though everyone knew the truth. He chose the back door before accountability could knock harder. His silence in the final meeting said more than any speech could. He never admitted wrongdoing, never apologized, but the weight of what he didn't say lingered long after he stepped down. He faded into the background, a man who might have been a hero if he'd chosen to speak sooner. Officer Cruz stayed. He didn't just stay, he rebuilt. He became a voice within the department, a bridge between officers still resistant to change and the community that had every right to distrust them. He helped redesign training programs rooted in ethics, empathy, and racial awareness. He led conversations that made people squirm but forced them to grow. He didn't hide from his past, he used it. And because of that, others followed. He wasn't a symbol of perfection. He was proof that change doesn't start with being right, it starts with being honest. Isaiah became something nobody had predicted, a leader. His voice, once shaky, became firm, then powerful. He organized after-school forums where kids shared their stories without judgment. He was invited to speak at city events, and eventually, to a national youth conference about resilience and justice. He wore no suits. He used no polished words. Just truth. Raw and plain. And when he spoke about that day outside the store, he didn't talk about pain, he talked about transformation. Not because it should have happened, but because what came after it mattered. And Amara Tate, she didn't vanish into paperwork or policy. She didn't rise to some distant administrative post or retire into quiet luxury. She stayed on the ground, where the work breathed. Her undercover days were over, but her mission had evolved. She became a national advisor on police reform initiatives, traveling from city to city, training agents, speaking in classrooms, standing in courtrooms not as a witness, but as a warrior of evidence. She wrote a book, not about herself, but about the people she met. The stories that shaped the fight. And she dedicated it to every voice that was told it didn't matter, and never stopped speaking anyway. One afternoon, standing outside that same corner store, now repainted and owned by a new family, Amara watched as a young girl helped an elderly man with his groceries. No yelling. No threats. Just quiet kindness. A moment so small, most people would miss it. But she didn't. Because she understood what it took to get to that peace. She knew that every calm moment was built on the ruins of a storm someone else survived. And this neighborhood, was finally breathing again. Now to you, the one listening. Maybe you've never worn a badge. Maybe you've never been profiled. Maybe you've never felt the chill of handcuffs on your skin or the heat of judgment in someone's stare. But maybe you felt invisible. Maybe you've been silenced when you tried to stand up. Maybe you've looked at the world and wondered if truth still matters. If justice still has a place in a system so tangled with fear. What Amara's story teaches us, what this story reminds us, is that justice doesn't arrive all at once. It's not clean. It's not easy. It doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes, it looks like exhaustion. Sometimes it looks like telling the truth, knowing you'll lose friends. Sometimes, it's the decision to speak when everyone else is quiet. And sometimes, it's the choice to listen, really listen, to someone whose life doesn't look like yours, but whose pain echoes in your bones just the same. So ask yourself, what silence have you been part of? What truth are you afraid to say out loud? And more importantly, what are you willing to do about it now? If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, or made you see someone else differently, share it. Talk about it. Reflect on it. And leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your voice. We need to hear your voice. Because change only happens when silence ends. And don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist, where every story has a turning point, and every voice matters.